In the world after coronavirus, we have with us Parag Khanna, author, futurist, and really big thinker. And we're going to talk to him about supply chains and globalization.
To talk about supply chains is to talk about globalization, because supply chains are truly the original world wide webs. Think about the word supply itself and the relationship between supply and demand. Truly the simplest principle of microeconomics. It also happens to be, in many ways, the principle that governs the world. How do we connect supply and demand? The supply of any particular good or technology or idea or even capital to where it is needed is what supply chains are about. Now, supply chains are always shifting, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, post the pandemic. Supply chains are always adapting, constantly morphing and shifting to find the path of least resistance, in the same way that water flowing down a mountain seeks the path of least resistance. And now you have a demand shock and a supply shock represented by the pandemic. You have the potential for a long-term sustained depression-like slowdown in the world economy. And that too is going to have an impact on where goods and services are produced. But many of the shifts that we're seeing in supply chains have already been happening. So let's take regionalism. The United States trades more with Mexico and more with Canada each than it does with China. Now, that obviously is not because of the coronavirus pandemic. It's because of many factors that relate to, among other things, the trade war. And that obviously began several years ago before the pandemic. Asia, again, before the trade war and before the pandemic, the majority of Asian trade was within Asia. So if we posit a world that is more regional than global, let us not say that the reason that happened is because of the pandemic. The pandemic accelerated something that was already quite well underway.
What parts do you think it will accelerate of this process? And what parts might it decelerate?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at energy markets, for example, now we have a tremendous slowdown in the volume of daily oil consumption. So you would say that, again, quantitatively, we're having a deceleration of energy globalization, if you will. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that's not a bad thing, because obviously moving energy or moving materials, moving cement, whatever the case may be around the world, is extremely damaging for the global environment. Why not favor a world in which much more energy is local and renewable? Now, areas that are accelerating are obviously digital. Here we are speaking on Zoom. The internet is, quote unquote, creaking at the seams of the high demand. So let's remember again, digital globalization was accelerating for quite a long time. Now, it's also too soon to say whether or not some of the areas of globalization that we've come to really take for granted, which way they're going to go. So, for example, two things that have really shocked the world, right now in the past few weeks is effectively the standstill in aviation and migration. In a way, the world population is really going through a reset. Just look at all of the Americans rushing back to America, all the Chinese going back to China. I live in Singapore, and there's an estimated 200,000 Singaporeans who have been abroad and are coming back every single day. Does this mean it's the end of migration? I can imagine very easily quite the opposite. The war for talent will most definitely continue. Migration will most definitely continue. And transportation will obviously rebound, but maybe the vectors will change. But globalization does, in fact, carry on.
So what might all of this mean? Globalization goes on as was, slows down, ramps up, becomes something totally different.
So I really don't want to say that globalization is either going to increase or decrease purely as a result of the pandemic. It's going to have a seismic impact in some areas, but less so in others. And it isn't even necessarily the cause. It could be a trigger or a contributor, but it isn't necessarily the underlying cause of many things that were already underway. Again, the regionalism of trade was well underway. The regionalization, in fact, of migration patterns has also been very much the norm. With capital flows and trade, again, or let's say capital flows, there I can imagine in some areas you will see a retrenchment of capital simply because the demand for offshoring of goods production may decrease. But on the other hand, let's remember that the fiscal instability or the fiscal trap that many countries are going to be in is going to require that pension funds, asset managers, institutional investors will be looking for high returns wherever they can find them. And if China and other Asian markets do move forward with attractive capital account liberalization, then trillions of dollars of Western money will flow into these emerging markets, particularly in Asia.